I'm Mark Simon. Welcome to the first edition of the game for 2021. We're so excited to be back. There's been a whole bunch of reasons, none of which we need to go into, but we're happy to be here. Kevin Mullen is here. Hi, Kevin. And Melissa Michelson, the doctor, is here from Brewer College. And so it's a great time to, there's a lot of ground to cover. But I'm happy to see all of you, and we're happy to be back on the air, or whatever you call it when you're online. Let's plunge right in. We're closing in on President Biden's first 100 days. Kevin, you go first. Give me your first sort of quick assessment of how you think he's done.
Well, I think he's been transformational as a president so far. This $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan is a huge undertaking. It's certainly a rescue plan in the moment focused on the pandemic, but there are some elements to this package that are really very serious anti-child poverty elements. This is a major expansion of government and government spending, directing it to lower income and working people in America. This is a huge deal. And frankly, if we were in any other place than a pandemic, this would have gotten more media attention, I think, than it did. But we're also going to see a transition to a massive infrastructure spending plan, potentially a $3 trillion spending plan that is going to be a jobs package. And as somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about infrastructure in California and climate change and green jobs and job generation, workforce development in general, this is going to be a transformational part B to this effort. So I'm very bullish on what Joe Biden has done to this point. There's lots to get into with regard to the rest of his agenda for his first term, maybe only term if he doesn't run for re-election. But I think he's wasting no time here. He is making a historical mark, really, with what he's come out with really in the first phase here of the first year of his presidency.
Melissa, if you had to bet on Joe Biden being a transformational political figure, I think a lot of people would have guessed otherwise. Do you agree with Kevin's assessment? And what do you think that it is about him
kind of transformed, right? Part of the reason I think that he won the primaries and became the nominee is because a lot of people thought, let's not get too progressive, let's not nominate a woman or a person of color, let's nominate Joe. He will be able to bring people back from the Republican Party. He'll be able to win this election and maybe heal some of the divisiveness. And I think that was based on memories of what Joe Biden used to believe in and the policies he used to support. And since then, he has become much progressive. He's changed his position on a lot of things, coming out in favor of more liberal policies that do allow him to be more transformational, implying that maybe he's in favor now of filibuster reform, which obviously is crucial. Because one of the things we can't lose sight of is that this fabulous $1.9 trillion package that Congress passed and Biden signed, yes, it's going to do all of these amazing things, but it was passed as part of budget reconciliation. And unless we get filibuster reform or some other way to move things forward in the Senate, there's not going to be a $3 trillion infrastructure bill. There's not going to be a We the People Act, Voting Rights Act. There's not going to be any of those other policies that Biden and the Democrats would like to see unless they get filibuster reform. And so on the one hand, yes, out of the gate, huge wins, right? But already it looks like he's going to start hitting some roadblocks because A, there's the filibuster, and B, other members of the Democratic Party in the Senate, what Joe Manchin had already figured out, which is if you're the last vote, you can get stuff, right? And so now Tammy Duckworth is saying, I'm not going to approve any more nominees unless I see some more diversity coming in these appointments, right? And so if the Democrats are already falling apart, right? Not falling apart, but, pushing back on the administration, and we still don't have filibuster reform, we might not see any more big victories.
Oh, it's interesting because one of the things, I just finished reading Obama's book on his first term in office. And one of the things that really leaped out at me at that is that he wasn't a political animal, that he was much more, I'm going to be a unifying force because of who I am and what I believe in. Joe Biden said in his inaugural address he wanted to be a unifying figure, but apparently he's willing to not have that be bipartisanship. I mean, the bailout bill was supported by 70%, so he pushed ahead. And I wonder if that's going to be part of one of the other characteristics of him. Really, it's the first time we've had in 2 or 3 presidencies a president who's really steeped in political experience and political expedience and how to get things through something like Congress. Your thoughts about that, Melissa?
Yeah, I think it does help that Biden has that experience, but on the other hand, Congress has really changed, and the level of partisan sorting and the level of partisan battling that we see in Congress, that's not the Senate that Joe Biden was a part of. And so I think to a degree, his sense of how you get things passed in Congress is a little bit outdated. And even if you look at how things were when Obama was president, right? It's still not like, it's just not like that now, and with such a tight margin. So yes, I'm sure it's helpful, right? Just as it was helpful for Lyndon Johnson to have been in the Senate before he was president. But I don't know how much that really helps Biden, given how much things have changed, how close that margin is in the Senate, and just how much divisiveness there is. That maybe his idea of bipartisanship is it supported by the public in a bipartisan sense, right? And let's not worry so much about whether 50 senators who are Republicans agree with what I want to do. But if something has 90% approval, like closing the gun show loophole on background checks, then let's go ahead and do that, even if every Republican in Congress is going to vote no. And that's still bipartisan because many Republicans in the public support it.
Kevin, you serve in a legislative body. Is knowing how to do politics, knowing how to legislate, how to do the politics of legislation, is it a neglected talent? Is it an overlooked talent? What's your sense of how important it is that he's good at this? I mean, the fact is, he went ahead and did something without a single Republican vote. You could argue that it's going to help in the midterms because it's a great issue to run on. And McConnell was complaining, well, he so much for bipartisanship, but he never said bipartisanship. He said unifying, which I think he doesn't see as quite the same thing.
Yeah, so a couple things to pick apart there. I think a knowledge of the legislative body and a knowledge of the language and the process can only help a president, but it's not determinative. I think giving nods to bipartisanship or unifying in the language that the president used, I think is important in terms of the message for the American people. I think people like the idea that you're working across the political spectrum, but ultimately you've got to deliver. And I think it actually has handed the Democrats an issue that they're the ones getting things done in the face of resistance by a Republican minority at this point. But just back very quickly to infrastructure. Yeah, it's probably going to be hard to get like a big, broad bipartisan bill through. And filibuster reform is getting more and more attention, maybe not wholesale, doing away with the filibuster, but something sort of curtailing the elements of the filibuster when it can be employed. But infrastructure and possibly the return of earmarks where projects can be delivered in individual districts, bringing home the proverbial bacon, so to speak. I think some of that, particularly when it comes to infrastructure, can be bipartisan, actually can get some Republican support if members are actually delivering projects for their home state or their home district. I don't think it's as pie in the sky, maybe, as some might think. Real projects, real money, delivering for your constituents still matters regardless of party. But yeah, he is operating in a much more partisan, divisive, polarized culture now than certainly when he was a senator. We are living in an alternate universe from the 1980s. And the 1990s with social media, right-wing talk radio, divided camps, primary challenges on the left and right, very different politics. But certainly he understands the scope and the sweep of what the US Senate can do. And I think that can only be helpful in him getting things done.
I want to switch gears a little bit, talk about here in California. It certainly looks like the governor is going to face a recall election. I'm sure he wishes he had never gone to the French Laundry for dinner, because it shows up in every single story, even if it's not about him. I mean, any story about any governor who's in trouble seems like the fifth paragraph of every story. And over in California, Gavin Newsom still trying to climb out of this hole. What's your first take on this? It's a two-step process, as you know. They have to vote to voters have to vote to recall him, so they have to vote yes on that. Then they have to elect somebody else. And you can make the case that he doesn't have, Melissa, the same problems that Gray Davis did. First of all, Gray Davis was facing this monstrous energy crisis that hits people, and we weren't coming out of it at the time he was up for recall, versus the coronavirus crisis that we seem to be coming out of, at least somewhat gradually. And then he had Arnold Schwarzenegger ready to run against him. And there doesn't seem to be anybody on the horizon who presents.
Well, I heard Tom Steyer commissioned a poll to see if he could get it. But yeah, I mean, I think that there are many differences between what happened in 2003 and what's going to happen this year. And I think Gavin Newsom will face a recall election, but does he lose that election? Well, in 2003, even though Darrell Issa was the one who put up all the money to get the signatures, it was the last minute entry of a superstar that really put the nail in the coffin. And it was the decision by Cruz Bustamante to run on the second part of the ballot, his lieutenant governor, that made people think like, okay, well, we can, vote for the recall, but then we can vote for Bustamante. And so we keep a Democrat. And I remember back then that there was a lot of discussion about, should Bustamante run as an alternate on the second part of the ballot, or was that sending the wrong message? Because then the Democratic Party's message was, don't vote for the recall and vote for Bustamante. Whereas it's a much cleaner message for the Democrats now to just say, don't vote for the recall. And if there's no high profile Democrat running to replace him, it's a cleaner way to keep people loyal. There's stronger Democratic Party dominance of the state now than there was 18 years ago. And so the likelihood that Newsom fails or is recalled and replaced is much lower because of those factors. But those things could change, right? Depending on how his polls are doing, depending on who decides to jump in. I don't think Arnold Schwarzenegger is going to jump in again. But if there was somebody with that kind of like star power, right? Maybe Elon Musk decides he's going to be governor. I don't actually know who this person is going to be, but imagine if somebody very popular decides they're going to, pay the minimal fee and jump in. Then maybe Newsom doesn't look so good. But as long as it's a lackluster field, as long as there's no high profile Democrats for sure, and as you mentioned, things are feeling better, right? The thing people were angry about with Gray Davis really did seem like his fault. I think the argument that Newsom, argument that Newsom is responsible for the dissatisfaction with their lives caused by the pandemic. Hey, pizza, be quiet. I'm trying to do a show. Yeah, this happens when I'm teaching all the time. Isn't it awesome? It's a much weaker connection, right? I mean, Gray Davis, it really, at the time, seemed like he was responsible for the blackouts. It really did seem at the time that he had lied about the scope of the California budget deficit. And so, I don't know that there's that same connection with Newsom and the stress that everybody's under because of the pandemic.
Yeah. There's another element. Schwarzenegger had a political profile because he was married to a Kennedy. He'd been active in politics, so it wasn't like he was starting from zero. Kevin, without asking you to name names, what's the likelihood of any kind of high-profile Democrat getting into this thing? Is Newsom perceived as that vulnerable within his own party, combined with, there are always going to be some ambitious people. I'll tell you what, let's have Kevin run.
Yeah, that is not going to happen. That's the one thing I do know. Anything short of the entrance of The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, entering the race, I think Newsom survives. And the dynamics are totally different than 2003. Frankly, well, speaking as a legislator, all of the political oxygen and all of the political coverage is going to be swallowed up by this recall that, frankly, I don't think is going to go anywhere. It'll qualify, but it's not going to pass. The polls are really pretty bad on it in terms of the recall. I think he survives rather easily. There may be some token Democrats. There's a ton of ambition. There's surplus ambition in California, but I don't think you're going to see a serious Democrat put their name on the ballot. And the Republican Party is in a pretty weakened state in California. This would have to be somebody who's a Democrat or an independent. And there really hasn't been somebody that has expressed interest at this point. But to Melissa's point, politics can change on a dime. I think we are turning the corner in the pandemic. Even as we speak, vaccine clinics are being set up around San Mateo County, looking locally here. But we are turning the corner in the pandemic with the vaccine distribution with Janssen single shot vaccine. And coming out of this, there's going to be a focus on economic recovery. The federal money is going to be incredibly helpful in terms of just kind of keeping things afloat in California. The one variable that you have to keep an eye on is school reopenings in the fall. What's interesting, I learned, let me say, the recall threshold to get a recall on the ballot is way too low. 12% signatures gathered based on the previous gubernatorial turnout. There's only 2 states in America that are lower, that are 10%. Most states don't have a recall provision for governor. The 20 states that do, the overwhelming majority of those are at 25% or even 30%, 33%. So it's too easy to qualify a recall election in California, a topic for a future legislative session, perhaps. But essentially, if the Democratic Party can sort of hold it together, so to speak, I think he survives this. The question is, what does this do in terms of the governor's first term agenda? There is so much that needs to be done in California post-pandemic to get our economy up and moving again, that I hope he doesn't spend his entire year focused on that and can work with our legislative leadership on addressing the big challenges that we have. And there are plenty of challenges to go around.
I think part of the challenge is that no matter what he does or what he talks about, everyone puts it into the frame of how does this affect the recall, right? So when he was asked a question the other day about Dianne Feinstein possibly needing to be replaced, everybody interpreted his response as, oh, he's trying to make sure he gets the Black female vote in the recall. Like no matter, so I think it's not so much whether the governor tries to make everything this year about the recall, it's that the media and the public will interpret everything through the lens of, is he just doing this because of the recall?
Yeah. As an aside, it's fascinating to think way back when Kamala Harris and Gavin Newsom were trying to decide who was going to run for what. Newsom chose governor because he thought it would be the most direct route to a possible White House run. That left Kamala Harris stuck with a Senate seat. And boy, it's looking like a good decision. It's a great example of how the best laid plans in politics were the old line, man plans and God laughs. Let me switch gears. I went to a news conference this morning in San Mateo. Every chief of police in San Mateo County was there to come out strongly against anti-Asian Pacific Islander violence. And the chief of police in Pacifica, who leads the county law enforcement group of chiefs, even said something about rhetoric and that people need to be on the watch even for that. The whole idea of if you see something, say something, and that extends not just to if you witness violence, but if you witness the precursors to violence. On the other hand, they acknowledge that there isn't a strong uptick of these incidents in San Mateo County. Now, one of the themes they were hitting on is because this is a community that has a long history of not reporting these things, of people standing silent in the face of these kinds of attacks. The thinking being that you can only make it worse by speaking up. But let's talk a little bit, Kevin, why is this happening now? Why is there an uptick now? Why is there so much attention being paid to this now?
Well, the numbers that I saw, not specific to San Mateo County, but nationally, these kinds of incidents are up 150% since 2019. There is no doubt that there was a spike happening here. And I have to believe that it is linked to the rhetoric that came from the previous president from the Oval Office, the megaphone of the Oval Office, and linking the pandemic to China. And just the tone and the tenor of the previous president and the predominance of right-wing rhetoric that's really hate-based rhetoric. You cannot look past that as a factor in all of this. I'm heartened by what I've seen in San Mateo County, public demonstrations of support for the API community. And it's not just those high-profile, really appalling, bone-chilling kinds of attacks that we see on the news, as awful as those are. It's the sort of day-to-day discrimination and comments and rhetoric that people endure, and we have to have a heightened sensitivity around it. We actually had in our budget have put some money toward better tracking these kinds of incidents in California to really take a comprehensive approach. But it's up to each and every one of us in every community to send the right kinds of messages and to stand with the API community. So I'm going to remain hopeful. Just as we were coming on the air, I say on the air, just as we were coming online, and we're taping this on the 23rd of March, my incredible colleague, Rob Bonta from the East Bay, my assembly colleague, was appointed the first Filipino American Attorney General, the top cop, the top law enforcement official in California, and he's going to be an incredible Attorney General. I'm excited about that. But he himself is going to have a platform to talk about all of these issues, and so all of these contributions are going to be important. So I was pleased to see the police chiefs. People listen to those chiefs in their communities, and that's all important to combat what's happening now.
Okay, just for the sake of the permanent record, it's the 24th.
Sorry.
It's okay. It's hard to keep track sometimes. I know you've got
It's
twins.
a pandemic. It's a pandemic. And twins. Oh my gosh.
It's, your thoughts, Melissa?
I think it's really hard to know for sure how much of this is happening because, as you mentioned, it just doesn't get reported. And that's not just true of Asian Pacific Islander Americans. Members of different historically marginalized groups, all different groups, tend not to report this sort of thing. And partly that's because they don't think anything will happen. They don't think law enforcement will do anything. And so one potential positive outcome of the police chiefs having this massive press conference and now Asian Pacific Islander being nominated to be the top cop in the state, maybe that shifts public opinion in the community. Think, okay, if I say something, I really will be taken seriously, right? Law enforcement really will care to know that this happened. And so we might see a huge increase in reporting, right? And again, then it's hard to know, like, how much is this an increase in reporting and how much is this an underlying increase in what's happening? Just from my own life though, right? Talking to people I know who are Asian Pacific Islander, I know that it's true, right? Because people mention it either on social media or in one-on-one conversations. And so I think like there's the lived reality that we probably all have as Californians, that we know that this rise in hate is happening because we're seeing it. And as Kevin mentioned, there's a pretty good explanation for why that happened with the former occupant of the White House and his hateful rhetoric. So hopefully, now that there are new occupants, now that there's going to be a new attorney general, you know, with law enforcement saying, hey, this isn't okay, right? And we're getting that message from everyone, right? Like my email inbox has been full of people declaring solidarity, from corporations to, organizations that I'm a member of. So hopefully, yes, maybe at the same time we see an increase in reporting because people feel like they're going to be heard, but maybe we'll also start to see less of it happening as people are keeping an eye out and maybe standing up for one another.
To the point about Kevin and the legislation, District Attorney Steve Wagstaff was at this event this morning and acknowledged that his office does not track. They track the race of criminals. They don't track the race or demographic breakdown of the victims. And in fact, he said that it was about 20 incidents a year ago in 2020 that he could say were racially related, but it was an estimate because he had to go talk to the people on his staff who prosecute those crimes. They don't track it. And like anything else, you start with information and it often drives public opinion, often drives legislation in a whole new direction. One of the things that was said at that by Amarance Lee, who's a San Mateo City Council member, talking about why the generation of her parents and grandparents would never have spoken up for whatever reason. I think not the least of which that they thought it would make things worse. She says that's not the case anymore. The way she put it was, there's a new generation. This is a new day and everything has changed. That's a really smooth segue to, we had a substantial change in November in city councils here on the peninsula. Many more women elected, many more people of color. How much of that do you think, Melissa, can be tied directly to district elections?
Oh, you are getting to one of my favorite topics, district elections. I think, yeah, the California Voting Rights Act is making a difference because it's forcing all of these jurisdictions to shift to district elections, usually because of the threat of litigation, but fine, that's a following of this piece of legislation. And political science research actually proves that it's having this effect, right? So there are scholars who have studied this and have shown definitively that when a jurisdiction, a city council, shifts to district elections, the percentage of city council members that is white decreases 10 to 12%. And that is much more likely when the Latino population of that city is at least 20%, right? So we have statistics that prove this. So yes. And then of course we also have our local experience, like no doubt, right? That these young people of color, some of them LGBTQ, some of them democratic socialists, right? Very young, very progressive people are getting elected to local councils because of district elections. Absolutely true.
Kevin, is there a generational change taking place? Are we seeing the shift to a new generation here on the peninsula?
I think so, to some degree. You still have, if you look at the overall elected officials pool, it's still predominantly older. It's whiter than the county population as a whole. But I think that generational change is coming. I think district elections are an important piece of that. It's going to probably take a few cycles of district elections for you to sort of resonate, sink in, and see some of those changes occur. Over time, I believe that those changes will happen. The other dynamic, and it doesn't get maybe as much attention as the district elections piece, is that there's been a whole move to move local nonpartisan elections to the general election in even years, right? So we had a race here in South San Francisco, my hometown, where James Coleman, a young man in his 20s, knocked off Rich Garbarino, a longstanding incumbent. But there was a shift to a district election, but that district election happened in a presidential year, a presidential November, where turnout in just that district went up compared to a normal municipal cycle that would be like an off year cycle. So you had people voting just in that one district who vote in presidential cycles, but don't vote in, say, gubernatorial cycles. Maybe some of those voters do. Certainly the the regular voters, but you had a pool of voters that don't normally participate in municipal elections when they had previously been in 2017, 2015, and 2013. So those two dynamics, a different electorate, a different candidate pool, and really different voters choosing these candidates in these district elections, and that's where you're going to see a real change occur.
Speaking of your hometown of South City, where you launched your fabulous political career, we've seen a couple of issues come up, and it seems like the cities that have had district elections, as Melissa said, elect more progressive people, certainly a wider range of people reflecting the fuller demographics of the county. And so you're seeing things like much more aggressive legislation on housing and allowing multiple unit housing, higher density housing. You're seeing the city councils actively set pay scales for hazard pay, for additional kinds of pay. Is that another example of a generational change that's taking place? Or is it maybe too soon to say for that for sure? But Redwood City is another council where they're much more progressive than they would have been just a year ago.
Yeah, well, I think that's a reflection of the fact that many of these folks getting elected in local office, even though these are nonpartisan offices, they are Democrats. The Democratic Party as a whole, I think, is tacking to the left. Even though we elected a fairly centrist president in President Biden, as Melissa said, he is tacking to the left. He can read the room. There's a desire that, sort of centrist policies have not really resulted in kind of transformational personal economic change for people. A lot of people are struggling. It's been heightened by this pandemic. You see the divisions. You see a renewed call for equity, that equity should be factored into all public decisions. So I think, yes, there's a generational change coming, but I also think it's a reflection of a real a need, a desire, particularly among younger people, that their needs aren't being met by the status quo, that there's not enough housing being built. It's not affordable enough. Service workers are being forced out of San Mateo County because of the cost structure. We have an affordability crisis. You're seeing these younger politicians in particular giving a voice to this, but I think it's also a reflection, not only generational, but also sort of more broadly in the Democratic Party, even though these are nonpartisan contests.
And I would add that it's not just the young people.
So you were referencing. Go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted to say it's not just the young people, it's their parents. I have two sons in their late 20s and they can't afford to move out, right? So how do you keep your family near you if the young people in your family can't afford someplace to live? So it's not just that the 20-somethings and 30-somethings want a place to live and they can't afford one. It's their parents now are torn between, how do I now leave California because I can't be with maybe I'm getting too personal, but it just seems like this, it doesn't just affect younger people because those younger people have older people in their families who also want them to be able to afford housing.
We've been on a little over half an hour. We've tried to cover a lot of ground. It has been a long time since we've been together like this. So we're going to move on and schedule another show. Before we go, I want to take a moment, Kevin, to speak about your dad, Gene Mullen. We know he's in declining health and that he's in hospice. And I want to tell you on behalf of certainly my experience with him, but I think for a lot of people, he's just been an outstanding public servant. I'm proud to have known him, proud to be his friend. I'm sure he's proud of his son, who's serving in the Gene Mullen seat. But please tell him on behalf of us, and I think everybody who might be watching, that our hearts go with him and that we're crazy about him and that we wish him the very best.
Hey, thank you, man. While he's been on hospice, I've been with him at his house in South San Francisco, and it's actually been an incredibly meaningful and rich time, even though he's in severely declining health, to be able to spend this time with him, actually away from Sacramento for a few weeks here. So thank you for that. And he's gotten some really nice calls and emails, which have given him a real lift and given me a lift and my sister as well. So thank you for that, Mark. I will share that with him, and I'll make sure he watches the game.
Well, he was always a loyal viewer, even if sometimes he was the only one. Kevin, Melissa, thank you so much for being here. Thank you all for watching the game again. Thanks to Rocky Robinson for making this happen. We'll see you again soon on the game.